There is a moment in every man's life when he realizes that the world he has been living in was never built for his growth. It was built for his compliance, a silent architecture designed to keep him predictable, harmless, and easy to categorize. And most men accept this. They move through life like shadows, repeating inherited patterns, copying desires that were never theirs, and defending routines that drain their spirit. But then there is the other man, the one who senses something is off. He feels the tension between who he is and who he is expected to be. He feels a quiet suffocation whenever he tries to fit into the spaces others designed for him. And one day, without warning, something inside him refuses to obey anymore. That is the beginning of departure. Not a physical journey, but a psychological revolt. A private decision that whispers, "I can no longer remain here." Leaving the herd is not glamorous. It is not cinematic. It is not applauded. In fact, it is almost always punished, because the moment a man begins to step out of the predictable patterns, he becomes a threat, not because he is dangerous, but because he exposes the fragility of everyone else's conformity. His refusal to play the game forces others to confront the truth they have spent their whole lives avoiding. They were never choosing their life. They were inheriting it. This is why the first step away from the herd is always lonely. It is supposed to be. When a man decides to think for himself, something strange happens. The voices that once surrounded him, the ones telling him how to behave, what to believe, who to be, begin to fade. And what replaces them is not silence, but a deeper, heavier sound, the weight of his own mind. For the first time, he is forced to hear himself without distractions, without noise, without the comfort of the crowd's expectations. This is where most men turn back. Because independence sounds noble until you actually feel it. It feels like standing on a cliff with no guarantee of safety. It feels like losing the approval that once made you feel secure. It feels like stepping into a space where no validation follows you. The herd does not hate the man who walks alone. It fears him because he reminds them that freedom requires sacrifice, and they are not willing to pay the price. Nietzsche understood this well. He knew that greatness never emerges from comfort, and that the man who rises must first detach himself from those who cling to the familiar. The herd survives by collective certainty. The lone man survives by internal clarity. He stops looking outward for direction and starts looking inward for purpose. But this moment, the moment of departure, is not triumphant. It is disorienting. When you leave behind the emotional noise of society, you lose more than illusions. You lose companionship, even if it was superficial. You lose belonging, even if it was false. And you lose identity, even if it was borrowed. You step into a psychological wilderness with nothing but your own consciousness as a guide. And that is where the transformation begins. Every legendary figure, every philosopher, warrior, creator, visionary experienced this rupture. Not because they wanted to be special, but because they were no longer capable of tolerating the smallness of a life lived for others. The herd demands sameness. Legends demand evolution. And evolution does not happen in groups. It happens in the unplugged darkness where a man confronts the truth of who he is. When you leave the herd, you are stripped of the illusions that once held you together. You realize that the friendships you thought were meaningful were often held together by shared weakness, not shared strength. The goals you once chased were merely distractions from the terror of confronting your true potential, and the identity you wore was not chosen. It was assigned. Departure is the death of the old self, and death is always a solitary act. The man who chooses this path will not feel powerful at first. He will feel exposed, vulnerable, unanchored. He will question himself. He will wonder if he has made a mistake. He will feel the pull to return to the familiar world he tried to escape. This is the test, the psychological initiation, the moment that separates the ordinary from the exceptional. Because the truth is simple, if leaving the herd were easy, everyone would do it. If thinking independently required no sacrifice, every man would be wise. If becoming legendary demanded no inner war, every life would be extraordinary. But the herd survives precisely because most men cannot handle the weight of their own freedom. Walking alone forces a man to confront parts of himself he never had to see before. His fears, his insecurities, his indecision. There is nowhere to hide them anymore. Without the distractions of social approval or group identity, he must finally ask himself, what do I truly believe? What do I truly desire? Who am I without external validation? And at first, these questions feel like attacks, but eventually they become a foundation. The loneliness of departure is not a punishment. It is the purification of identity. It is the stripping away of every borrowed belief until only truth remains. It is the thinning of the noise until a single steady voice emerges from within, the voice that was drowned out by society for years. When a man finally hears that voice, even faintly, something shifts. He realizes the loneliness he feared is not emptiness. It is clarity. It is space to think, room to grow, freedom to recreate himself without interference. It is the beginning of self-authorship. It is the quiet birth of sovereignty. And that is why the man who walks alone eventually becomes a legend. Not because he was destined to be great, but because he was willing to endure what others avoid. He was willing to detach, to question, to break away from the collective hypnosis. He was willing to face the loneliness of becoming someone new. The herd moves in circles. The lone man moves forward. He does not rise because he is extraordinary. He rises because he refuses to remain ordinary. And departure, that first painful step away from familiarity, is the moment his legend begins. There comes a point when the noise of the world becomes so loud, so constant, so invasive, that a man can no longer hear himself. Every voice around him demands something: approval, conformity, reaction, agreement. The world pulls at him like thousands of invisible threads, each one tugging him away from his center. And as long as he remains surrounded by people, ideas, and expectations, he never learns who he is beneath the layers. Solitude is not an escape from the world. It is a return to the self. It is the moment a man steps into silence and realizes that the greatest battles are fought internally, not externally. The mind becomes a furnace. The heart becomes a crucible. And isolation becomes the forge where the weak fragments of identity are burned away, leaving only what is strong enough to survive. Most people fear solitude because it exposes them. Without the noise of others, they must confront the truth they've been avoiding. Without company, they must reckon with their own emptiness. Without distraction, they must listen to the voice they've spent years drowning out. But the man who seeks solitude willingly does not run from this confrontation. He moves toward it, because he understands something the herd does not. Isolation is not loneliness. It is intensification. It is clarity. It is pressure. It is transformation. Nietzsche believed that a man who cannot endure solitude cannot create anything of value, because creation of self, of ideas, of direction requires uninterrupted contact with one's inner world. And that world is not quiet. It is stormy. It is chaotic. It is honest in ways society can never be. In solitude, the mind opens, not peacefully, but violently. Memories surface. Doubts rise, old wounds vibrate, ambitions whisper, the ego collapses, the illusions that once protected a man dissolve, leaving him exposed to himself. And it is only in this exposure that he begins to evolve. Isolation forces a man to become the observer of his own mind. Instead of reacting impulsively, he watches. Instead of escaping discomfort, he studies it. And as he does, he begins to understand the architecture of his own psychology. He sees which fears are real and which are inherited. He sees which desires belong to him and which were implanted by society. He sees the thoughts that strengthen him and the thoughts that sabotage him. This kind of self-awareness cannot be learned in groups. The herd does not encourage introspection. It encourages imitation. Only a man who walks into solitude willingly can learn the discipline of thinking for himself. Only he can learn to recognize his own voice among the countless echoes of culture. Only he can develop the mental toughness required to stand alone without collapsing under the weight of uncertainty. Solitude teaches him something profound. The mind is not a cage. It is a weapon. And like any weapon, it must be sharpened, tempered, tested. Isolation is that test. Most men crumble when they are alone because they have never learned to manage their inner world. They seek comfort in constant attachment. They depend on the presence of others to avoid the discomfort of their own thoughts. They fear silence because it reveals how much of their identity is built on external input. But the man who chooses solitude learns to reverse this dependence. He begins to feed his mind from within instead of from without. He learns to regulate his emotional storms. He learns to sit with discomfort until it transforms into insight. He learns to harness focus that the ordinary man will never experience, because focus requires a mind unpolluted by noise. Slowly, the chaos inside him takes shape. Thoughts become ordered. Intentions become precise. Vision sharpens like a blade. He develops the rare ability to be unaffected by external influences. Society's trends do not sway him. The opinions of others do not anchor him. Emotional manipulation fails to control him, because solitude has carved something unshakable inside him, a center of gravity that no one can access but him. This is how an unbreakable mind is formed, not through comfort, but through self-confrontation, not through praise, but through silence, not through company, but through aloneness. Isolation becomes the psychological gym where discipline is trained, resilience is built, and purpose is refined. A man begins to understand what truly matters because there is nothing left to divert his attention. And in this concentrated awareness, he discovers a version of himself that is sharper, stronger, and more stable than anything society could manufacture. He learns that power does not come from being surrounded by people. Power comes from being unaffected by their absence. This is why solitude is essential. It is not an exile. It is an initiation. The man who can stand alone becomes immune to the fear of abandonment. The man who can think alone becomes immune to manipulation. The man who can grow alone becomes immune to stagnation. He becomes self-sufficient not because he rejects others, but because he no longer needs them as psychological crutches. His mind becomes his anchor. His silence becomes his sanctuary. His solitude becomes his source of strength. And here is the paradox that Nietzsche understood. Once a man no longer needs the world begins to need him, because independence is magnetic, clarity is rare, strength is admired, and a man who has forged himself in solitude becomes something almost mythic, a figure who rises above the ordinary instincts of the herd. He is not shaken by chaos. He is not blinded by emotion. He is not trapped by conformity. He is not controlled by fear. His solitude has made him sovereign. His mind has become unbreakable. People sense this. They feel the difference in his presence. There is a weight to him, a depth, a calm intensity that only comes from a man who has wrestled with his inner world and emerged with mastery. His confidence is not loud. It is grounded. His direction is not borrowed. It is self-created. His strength is not aggressive. It is silent, steady, undeniable. This is the man who becomes a legend not because he seeks recognition, but because he embodies a form of psychological power that the modern world has forgotten, the strength to stand alone. And isolation was the forge that made him this way. He walked into silence and discovered his voice. He stepped away from noise and discovered his clarity. He endured solitude and discovered his selfhood. In the world of constant distraction, a man who can be alone with his own mind is rare. In a world drowning in noise, a man who thinks independently is dangerous. In a world addicted to comfort, a man who grows through solitude becomes unstoppable. This is why the man who walks alone transforms. This is why he rises. This is why his legend begins in silence. Every man carries a hidden battlefield inside him, a place no one else has access to, a landscape made of memories, fears, impulses, fantasies, and scars. It is the arena where his strongest desires clash with his deepest insecurities, where his intellect collides with his instincts, where his ideals wage war against his darker impulses. This territory is invisible to others, yet it shapes everything about him. And the tragedy is simple. Most men will live and die without ever setting foot on this inner ground. But the man who walks alone has no escape from it. The silence he once sought for clarity eventually reveals its other purpose: confrontation. When a man steps away from the herd, the distractions that once shielded him vanish. The noise that kept his thoughts diluted disappears. The identities he borrowed from society fall apart, and suddenly he meets himself, the unfiltered, unedited, unmasked version. Not the image he shows the world, not the version he's proud of, but the one buried underneath years of avoidance. This meeting is not peaceful, it is not gentle, it is not inspiring, it is war. Because the self he discovers is not a single entity, it is a collection of characters, each fighting for dominance. The disciplined self and the impulsive self, the brave self and the terrified self, the visionary and the saboteur, the dreamer and the cynic, the child he used to be, and the man he hopes to become, and each one pulls him in a different direction. The war within begins when he realizes that the greatest enemy he will ever face is not another person. It is the part of himself that resists growth, resists responsibility, resists courage, the part that whispers convincing excuses, the part that clings to comfort, the part that fears what he could become. Most men never fight this enemy. They negotiate with it. They distract themselves from it. They drown it out with noise, entertainment, relationships, and obligations. But the man who embraces solitude has no such refuge. He must confront the self that no one else sees. In the quiet, his fears begin to surface. Not the obvious ones, but the subtle psychological fears that dictate his behavior without his awareness. Fear of inadequacy, fear of failure, fear of being exposed as not enough, fear of success and the responsibility it demands, fear of becoming someone his past can no longer recognize. These fears are not loud, they are insidious. They shape how he hesitates, how he procrastinates, how he hides behind false identity. And now, with no distraction left to protect him, he sees them clearly. But he sees something else too, something even more unsettling. He sees his potential, not the sanitized version he imagines when he daydreams, but the raw, terrifying reality of what he could be if he stopped lying to himself. Potential is frightening because it reveals how much of his life has been wasted avoiding the work required to realize it. It reveals how powerful he could be and how much he has settled for less. This realization is painful. It burns the ego. It forces him to admit the enemy was never the world. It was the smallness within himself. This is the true war within. It is not about defeating weakness. It is about acknowledging it, understanding it, and refusing to let it dictate the future. The man who steps into this inner battlefield soon learns something that Nietzsche understood deeply. Growth does not come from comfort. It comes from conflict. A man evolves when the different parts of his psyche fight for dominance, and he consciously chooses which one will win. He chooses discipline over impulse. He chooses courage over fear. He chooses responsibility over avoidance. He chooses truth over illusion. This choice is not made once. It is made daily, hourly, sometimes moment by moment. Because the war never ends, it only becomes more strategic. A man with an unbreakable mind does not win by eliminating his darkness. He wins by integrating it, by understanding his destructive impulses, by mastering his shadow, by giving his aggression purpose, by giving his pain meaning. The war within becomes a training ground, not a curse. And in this battleground, he discovers something profound. The parts of himself he once feared are the same parts that hold his strength. His anger becomes fuel for ambition. His fear becomes a map of where he must go. His pain becomes wisdom. His loneliness becomes clarity. His insecurity becomes a compass for growth. This is the alchemy of self-knowledge, turning inner chaos into inner power. But this transformation requires brutal honesty, and honesty is expensive. It demands ego death. It demands surrender of illusions. It demands the courage to admit that everything he blamed the world for was at some level a reflection of himself. Most men will never pay this price. It is easier to remain ignorant of the war than to fight it. But the man who walks alone does not have the luxury of ignorance. His solitude acts like a mirror that cannot be avoided. It shows him not only who he is, but who he pretends to be. And once he sees this truth, he can no longer live in denial. He must choose, evolve, or remain trapped in the character he built to please others. Once he chooses evolution, something extraordinary happens. The battlefield inside him becomes quieter, not because the fight has ended, but because he has taken command of it. He becomes the general of his own psyche. He can sense when doubt is approaching. He can recognize when fear is preparing an attack. He can predict when laziness will try to infiltrate his purpose. And instead of being ambushed by his weaknesses, he prepares for them. He becomes strategic with himself. He becomes disciplined with himself. He becomes dangerous to the excuses that once controlled him. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift takes place. The self he once feared becomes the self he trusts. The thoughts that once sabotaged him now strengthen him. The emotions that once overwhelmed him now fuel his purpose. He becomes an integrated man, a man who has walked into his own mind and conquered its chaos. A man who no longer seeks validation because he understands his worth. A man who no longer fears judgment because he has judged himself more honestly than anyone else could. A man who no longer runs from discomfort because he knows discomfort is the doorway to transformation. This is the man who becomes unshakable, not because he is perfect, but because he knows the terrain of his own soul. He has fought the battles others avoid. He has confronted the shadows others bury. He has emerged with a strength that cannot be imitated, only earned. And that is the secret of the war within. You do not win by destroying yourself. You win by meeting yourself. The man who confronts the self no one else sees becomes the man no one else can break, because he has already faced the hardest enemy he will ever encounter. And he survived. There is a moment, often quiet and unannounced, when a man realizes that the life he is living was never truly his. It was assembled from the expectations of others, shaped by cultural momentum, and decorated with goals he never consciously chose. He wakes up one day and feels it, the hollowness of imitating a path that was never meant for him. This awakening is not comfortable. It is not gentle. It is not convenient. It is disruptive. It is destabilizing. It is a breaking of the old narrative, because once he sees through the illusion, he cannot unsee it. And the man who once followed now faces the terrifying question, what do I truly want if no one else is telling me what to want? This question marks the beginning of becoming a creator, the moment a man steps away from borrowed meaning and begins constructing a life from his own internal blueprint. Most men never reach this stage, not because they lack intelligence or potential, but because becoming a creator requires something the world quietly discourages: responsibility for one's own destiny. The herd gives men pre-written scripts. It gives ready-made identities. It gives the illusion of choice while ensuring no one actually leaves the boundaries. But the man who walks alone discovers that no real growth occurs inside boundaries. Vision does not flourish inside permission. Greatness does not emerge from imitation. A creator must tear down the scaffolding of his old life, the beliefs he inherited, the roles he played, the stories he repeated. And tearing down is painful. It feels like betrayal. It feels like loss. It feels like a death, because it is a death. The death of the version of the man who lived for others. And from that psychological rubble, something new begins to form. At first, becoming the creator feels like standing in an open landscape with no map, no guidance, no applause, just space, possibility, and pressure. The pressure to choose. The freedom that once seemed liberating now feels heavy because it reveals the uncomfortable truth. There is no one left to blame. No system, no people, no circumstances, only him. This transformation requires a different kind of courage. Not the courage to fight the world, but the courage to claim authority over one's own existence. Nietzsche understood this deeply. He believed that the greatest act a man could perform was the creation of his own values. A rebellion against inherited meaning, a revolt against passive living. To become the creator is to stop waiting for permission and start shaping reality according to one's own inner necessity. A man who becomes the creator stops asking, "What should I do?" Instead, he asks, "What is the path my soul is demanding I build?" Building that path is not straightforward. It is chaotic, non-linear, filled with setbacks and self-doubt. But creation was never meant to be clean. Creation is messy. Creation is conflict. Creation is the forging of structure from raw uncertainty. And yet, something remarkable happens when a man commits to constructing his own path. Slowly, he begins to assemble a life that reflects who he truly is, not who he was conditioned to be. His choices start aligning with his inner compass. His days begin to carry intention. His actions gain weight and precision. The world stops feeling random because he is no longer drifting. He is directing. He begins to feel a sense of authorship that most men will never experience. A man who becomes the creator no longer searches for meaning. He produces it. He no longer adapts himself to the world. He shapes the world around him. He no longer fears uncertainty. He uses it as material. This is why society fears men like this. A man who builds his own path becomes unpredictable. He becomes uncontrollable. He becomes sovereign. The world cannot manipulate a man who refuses to outsource his direction. It cannot intimidate a man who sees obstacles as tools. It cannot define a man who defines himself. He becomes a force, not through aggression, but through clarity. And this clarity does not come from achieving greatness. It comes from the willingness to create, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when failure is possible, even when no one is watching or clapping. Creation is a rebellion against passivity. It is the declaration, I refuse to let life happen to me. I will shape it. The path a man builds is not always grand, but it is always his. And this hisness, this authenticity, is what strengthens him. It gives him direction when others are lost. It gives him purpose when others feel empty. It gives him discipline because he is no longer working for approval. He is working for fulfillment. The Creator learns something essential. Freedom without purpose becomes chaos. Freedom with purpose becomes power. When a man builds his path, he is not simply choosing goals. He is choosing identity. He is choosing direction. He is choosing who he is becoming. This is why the Creator is willing to endure hardship. The pain has meaning. The struggle has significance. The obstacles are not pointless. They are necessary steps in the architecture of his life. Creation transforms a man at the deepest psychological level. It makes him resilient because he has something worth protecting. It makes him disciplined because he has something worth building. It makes him patient because he understands the timeline of greatness is not the timeline of convenience. And slowly, the world begins to notice. Not because he tries to be noticed, but because creation leaves undeniable traces. A man walking a path he built has a presence that cannot be replicated. He moves differently, grounded, intentional, unhurried. He speaks differently, with conviction instead of confusion. He thinks differently, long-term instead of impulsively. He stops seeking validation because the act of creation itself is validating. He stops comparing himself to others because comparison becomes irrelevant. He stops feeling lost because he is no longer wandering. He is building. A man who becomes the Creator enters a rare psychological state. He trusts himself. He follows himself. He becomes loyal to himself. And once a man reaches this point, something extraordinary happens. The world begins to bend around him. Opportunities align with his direction. People recognize his clarity. Chaos becomes manageable. Life stops feeling like a series of random events and begins to feel like a coherent narrative. His narrative, his blueprint, his creation. And this is the hidden truth Nietzsche pointed toward. The man who becomes the Creator does not simply live differently. He becomes different. He becomes someone the world cannot ignore. Not because he demands attention, but because he embodies the rarest form of power, a self-created identity, a self-created mission, a self-created path. His footsteps leave a trail. His actions leave a pattern. His life leaves a message. And in time, that message becomes a legend. There is a particular kind of silence that unsettles people. Not the silence of shyness, not the silence of politeness, but the silence of a man who no longer needs the world. A man who has withdrawn from noise, from validation, from the frantic dance of collective expectations. A man whose thoughts do not leak into conversation, whose emotions do not spill out in reaction, whose presence cannot be predicted or controlled. This silence is not emptiness, it is power. And society has always feared this kind of power because the silent man is not participating in the performance. He is observing it. He is studying patterns while others follow them. He is seeing truth while others hide behind illusions. There is nothing more threatening to a world built on conformity than a man who refuses to play the game. From the beginning of human history, society has relied on noise, shared beliefs, shared outrage, shared rituals, shared distractions, to keep people aligned. Noise is a tool. It keeps minds occupied and emotions synchronized. It prevents individuals from drifting too far inward, where real independence is born. But the man who walks alone disrupts this. His silence creates a void people cannot understand. They project onto it. They fear it. They whisper about it. Because when a man is quiet, society cannot read him, cannot label him, cannot place him into the familiar categories that make others feel safe. So they fear him, not because he is dangerous in action, but because he is dangerous in potential. A silent man is unpredictable. A silent man is uncontrollable. A silent man is immune to manipulation. And this immunity is what society hates most. The average person depends on external noise to maintain their internal stability. Their beliefs come from others. Their emotions are reactions to others. Their identity is formed by comparison with others. When you remove the crowd, they lose themselves. But the lone man, he becomes even more himself. This difference creates psychological tension. People sense that the silent man has something they lack: self-possession, inner order, clarity. He is not moved by trends, nor swayed by opinion, nor pulled by the emotional currents that drag everyone else. He does not desperately seek belonging because he belongs to himself. This kind of independence feels threatening because it exposes how dependent others truly are. Society has a rule. It never states aloud, "Stay like us, or we will turn against you." The man who speaks too loudly is attacked, but the man who stops speaking at all is feared. Silence becomes his armor. Distance becomes his clarity. Self-reliance becomes his protection, but it also becomes the reason society tries to pull him back. People will say he is cold, arrogant, strange, removed, dangerous, too quiet. They will invent stories to explain why he does not behave like them, because they cannot accept the possibility that he has risen above the emotional mechanisms that control them. Most people need others to mirror their worldview, so they feel validated. But the silent man offers no mirror. He offers only presence. And presence, when not diluted by noise, becomes intimidating. It is the same reason a lion calmly sitting is more frightening than one roaring. Stillness reveals control. Calm reveals strength. Silence reveals mastery. A man who does not need attention holds more power than the man who demands it. Society rewards loudness, opinions, reactions, displays of emotion, because loudness is easy to classify. It is predictable. It is safe. But a man who is quiet cannot be categorized. He is not declaring his loyalties. He is not revealing his weaknesses. He is not participating in the collective emotional cycle. He has stepped outside of it entirely. And this is where fear emerges. Because if one man can step outside, others might follow. And if enough men follow, the structure collapses. Every society depends on conformity to survive. Every system depends on participation to maintain its illusion. Every group depends on agreement to validate itself. The lone man stands as living evidence that another way is possible. His silence is not rejection, it is liberation. His distance is not anger, it is clarity. His independence is not rebellion, it is evolution. This evolution threatens everything built on emotional dependency. Nietzsche understood that society fears the individual who no longer requires it, because such a man cannot be bribed with approval, guilted with shame, controlled with fear, or manipulated with promises. He has broken the psychological mechanisms that keep the herd together. This makes him a danger, not to people themselves, but to the system that relies on their conformity. The silent man becomes a symbol, even if he doesn't want to be. A symbol of someone who has stepped beyond, a symbol of self-mastery, a symbol of what others could be if they stopped performing for the world. And society fears symbols. Symbols inspire. Symbols break conditioning. Symbols create possibility. People will attempt to interpret his silence as emptiness. But it is not emptiness, it is fullness contained. They will interpret his detachment as indifference, but it is not indifference. It is focus. They will interpret his solitude as weakness, but it is not weakness. It is the birthplace of strength. For the lone man, silence is a strategy. He preserves energy. He observes before acting. He speaks only when necessary. He refuses to waste his essence on noise. And here lies the secret. A man who has mastered silence has mastered himself. He does not react impulsively. He is not dragged by emotion. He does not fear judgment. He does not depend on approval. His mind becomes an internal fortress. His will becomes uncompromising. His direction becomes unstoppable. This is the man society fears, not the loud revolutionary shouting in the streets, but the quiet thinker building a new reality inside his mind. Loud men attempt to break systems from the outside. Silent men transcend them from within. And transcendence is far more dangerous, because once a man rises above the emotional gravity of the herd, he becomes proof that the herd is optional. His existence becomes a challenge. His silence becomes a message. His independence becomes a mirror reflecting the insecurities of others. In truth, the lone man is not feared because he is dangerous. He is feared because he is free, and freedom is contagious. He walks alone, not because he rejects the world, but because the world no longer defines him. He does not isolate himself to avoid people. He isolates himself to remain sovereign. His silence does not threaten society through aggression, but through example. The lone man shows that a life built from within is possible. That clarity is possible. That psychological independence is possible. That walking away from the noise is not death. It is rebirth. His silence is a warning and a promise. I belong to no one, and therefore I can become anything. And that possibility terrifies the world more than anything else. A strange thing happens when a man walks alone long enough. At first, the world dismisses him. It mocks him. It misunderstands him. People project their insecurities onto him, labeling him as lost, isolated, strange, too distant, too quiet. Society hates what it cannot categorize, and it fears what it cannot control. But over time, something begins to shift, not in him, but around him. Because the man who walks alone does not remain in the shadows forever. While the world was busy commenting, gossiping, comparing, and competing, he was transforming. While others sought attention, he sought mastery. While others chased acceptance, he chased clarity. While others reacted to the world, he rebuilt himself quietly, piece by piece, in solitude. And eventually, that work becomes visible, not because he tries to show it, but because true transformation cannot be hidden. A man who has forged himself in silence carries a presence that speaks louder than any display. And in time, people begin to notice. At first, they notice the small things: his calmness, his focus, his refusal to be shaken by the chaos that overwhelms everyone else, his ability to remain centered when others panic, his grounded way of speaking, measured, intentional, unbothered. People sense that he operates on a different frequency, a frequency crafted through struggle, not inherited, a frequency shaped by loneliness, not by applause. And this difference makes them curious. They begin to wonder, who is he becoming? What did he do when we weren't watching? How did he develop this strength, this presence, this control? Their curiosity grows because human beings instinctively recognize authenticity. They can feel when someone has built himself from the inside out. They can sense when a man's confidence is earned rather than performed. This is the beginning of the legend. A legend is not created when a man reaches the world. A legend is created when the world finally sees what he has become without it. The birth of a legend is not noisy. It does not arrive with announcements or celebrations. It begins quietly, in whispers, in questions, in curiosity that spreads through observation rather than storytelling. People watch him the way one watches a fire from a distance, not because it demands attention, but because it holds something ancient, something primal, something undeniably powerful. And slowly, admiration begins to replace misunderstanding. Those who once doubted him now mimic him. Those who once judged him now study him. Those who once ignored him now seek his presence. Those who once feared his silence now crave his guidance, because human beings are drawn to strength that does not need to prove itself. They are drawn to clarity that is not shaken by opinion. They are drawn to independence that is not fueled by arrogance, but by inner necessity. And the man who walks alone embodies all of these things. His solitude has refined him. His battles have disciplined him. His silence has sharpened him. His selfhood has deepened him. This depth is what people notice first. The world is full of shallow identities, people shaped by trends, emotions, and external noise. But the lone man has depth created through introspection, suffering, rebuilding, and clarity. His depth sets him apart the way a mountain stands apart from the hills surrounding it. But that is not all the world sees. They also see his consistency. The path he once walked alone is now clear, and it reveals something undeniable. He did not bend. He did not break. He did not drift. He stayed true to the direction his inner voice demanded, even when no one believed in him. Consistency becomes proof. Proof becomes reputation. Reputation becomes myth. And myth becomes legend. A legend is born when a man's life becomes a reference point for others, a standard, a symbol, a reminder of what is possible when someone refuses to be shaped by the herd. But legend is not fame. Legend is not popularity. Legend is not applause. Legend is impact. And impact begins with the way a man transforms reality by transforming himself. People begin to seek his advice, not because he is loud, but because he is intentional. They want to know how he thinks, how he lives, how he sees the world. They feel something in him that they cannot find in themselves: sovereignty. The world has always admired the sovereign man, the man who is whole, the man who is disciplined, the man who follows a purpose instead of pleasure, the man whose presence alters the energy of a room even when he says nothing. This is the moment the world realizes he is no longer just a man walking alone. He is a man walking ahead. And those who once dismissed him suddenly begin to follow, from a distance at first, then more closely, as they understand the truth. The path he built in isolation became a path others now need. This is the irony of legend. He became what society needed precisely because he no longer needed society. Nietzsche hinted at this paradox. The man who surpasses himself inevitably surpasses the world around him. And once he does, the world redefines him as something rare, exceptional, even mythical. This is how a legend is born, not through status, but through substance, not through performance, but through presence, not through noise, but through silence, not through imitation, but through authenticity. People begin telling stories about him, how he changed, how he endured, how he grew, how he never lost himself, even when he walked alone. And these stories travel further than the man himself ever intended. They inspire. They challenge, they awaken the dormant potential in others, because the presence of a self-created man forces everyone else to confront the truth of their own unfinished selves. That confrontation is uncomfortable, but it is also magnetic. People are drawn to what they wish they could become. They are drawn to the one who proves it can be done. In this way, the lone man becomes a symbol, not by choice, but by inevitability. His life becomes a map for others lost in the fog of conformity. His journey becomes evidence that transformation is possible without permission. His silence becomes a teaching. His path becomes an invitation. And eventually, the world does not just notice him. The world elevates him, not as a perfect man, but as a forged one. Not as a flawless man, but as an authentic one. Not as a loud man, but as a sovereign one. Legend begins the moment the world realizes something undeniable. The man who walked alone was never wandering. He was building something they could not see yet. And now that they see it, they cannot look away. The birth of a legend is not the end of the journey. It is the moment the world catches up to the man who left it behind long ago.